Hi, my name is Robert. This video is designed to give you step-by-step detailed instructions on completing the task at hand. Please read the comments in the About section of this video. It has valuable information and updates. My YouTube channel has a disclaimer video that I encourage you to watch. And please like, share, and subscribe. I hope you found what you're looking for. Thank you very much for watching. In this video, I'm going to replace the rear shocks and the springs in my 850 Volvo T5R. The reason I'm replacing the springs is this car was equipped with the Nivomats, and I do not have a good set of those to replace these old ones with. Now these 850s, they mount a lot different from the V70s, especially the V70s are all-wheel drive, so they're a different creature. So unless you want to replace the whole rear end to the V70 configuration, you can just replace the springs and the shocks to get your 850 converted to the standard suspension. Now, if I load my car, this rear end would sag, gosh, probably about 2 inches, which I didn't have a lot of weight back there, but they're just worn out. They're popping, creaking, and everything else. Not too many 850s were equipped with the Nivomats, but you can see the spring, and then just to the right of that is the Nivomats shock absorbers that are self-leveling. Basically, when you start driving, the slight or decent bumps in them cause them to pump up to their, I guess, programmed height. The springs are not as heavy duty as the springs that come on the standard versions. So if you pull out your Nivomats, you need to replace the springs as well. So I got a pair out of the salvage yard because I'm not in a position to buy new ones. This should be pretty straightforward. Jack up the vehicle, support it on jack stands, get under it, take the bolt out of the spring, take the spring loose and work it out of the spring cups, then go inside the vehicle and take the upper shock mount loose if you're pulling them with the shock mount, and then come under the car and take the one bolt loose that holds the shock to the suspension. That could be 15 minutes per side. I don't even think you have to remove the wheel, but you can if you like. First thing I'm going to do, and it's best to do this on a level surface, and since I'm not on a level surface, I'm going to put some wheel stops on the front wheels, and then I'm going to jack up the car and install the jack stands. I have 24 1/4 inch on both sides, from the fender well to the ground. If your parking brake works, go ahead and set your parking brake. After you have the car jacked up and supported on the jack stand, come inside the vehicle, remove this piece of trim, and on both sides, this side and that side, I normally fold this panel up and I lift it up from the front and remove it. Now, I remove these 10 millimeters from both sides. After I get those 10 millimeters removed from both sides, I pull this forward and remove it because the shock mounts are under this panel. Once your shock mount is exposed, you got one of two options. Number one, removing this nut in the middle and removing the shock and leaving the mount. Two, if you're replacing the mount and shock together, because it's an old car, you may have a problem with the nut anchors up here in the frame of the vehicle. They like to break loose on these old cars. So you need to get under them and spray them down with PB Blaster or something a couple days before you try to pull them. Because if you try to pull these two bolts, the nuts under them may break loose and you'll have a mess on your hands. The shock mount bolts are 12 millimeter, and the shock bolt on top of the shock, I think, is a 17. Let me check. And the shock bolt on top is 18 millimeter. So let me see if I could get my shock loose, because my bolts have already busted the nuts loose on the back side, because I was going to try to replace them as an assembly with the mounts. You want to take this nut loose on top of the shock before you jack the car up, because once the weight is off of the shock, it won't come loose. It'll just spin around. So I have this nut loose from the shock. Now it can be removed from the bottom. Unfortunately, this is what was under the shock mount on the underside in the rear. There was no chance, I don't believe, of that bolt ever coming out of that nut. So I'm going to have to figure out how to brace a bolt and nut to put this mount back in the secure position, to secure this mount back in the position it's supposed to be in. Alright, I jacked the vehicle up so that I can get at least 2 teeth out of the jack stand. Then I lowered the vehicle on the jack till there's about 3 or 4 inches off the ground. Next, I go ahead and take the lower shock mount loose there, and you can see the shock all torn up, the Nivomats. So I'm going to take that bolt loose. I believe it's 18 millimeter. Once you get the bolt off the bottom of the shock, go ahead and pry the shock off of the stud. And since you took the top of the shock loose, it'll go right ahead and fall right out onto the ground. Next, you want to remove the nut on the bottom of the spring mount. It's 15 millimeter. If there's any rust on the threads, go ahead and brush those off with a wire brush, and you may want to spray it with some penetrant like PB Blaster. Sometimes that little tab is bent over to the nut. If it is, just bend it back away from it so that you can get the socket on there. After the nut is removed, lift the mount up and out of the seat so that it's hanging in the spring like that. Then lower the jack the rest of the way that's supporting the suspension. That's where I jacked it up at. And because the shock is removed, that spring will extend all the way down and probably just fall out. And I have the jack stand up there at the frame, so it's not supporting the suspension. With the jack lowered all the way, you can see there's very little holding that spring in there. So I'm going to get something and pry it out. As you can see, when I started to pry, the wheel came down almost to the ground. Not quite, but the spring is barely in there. So let me get a screwdriver and pry that the rest of the way out. And here I have a medium-sized screwdriver, and I'm able to pry the spring the rest of the way out. Be careful that it doesn't fall on you or hit you when it comes out. It's a little heavy, and it may. As you can see, I grabbed it and jerked it out with my hand. And it has some water in that top plastic mount piece. The top of that spring mount had some water in it. I didn't know that it was catching water, probably because the top of the seat cushion there was deteriorated and letting water in there. So I'm going to brush the bottom of that off. I'm going to brush the top of that off with a wire brush. Probably wouldn't be a bad idea to spray paint it black, and I'm going to brush that out with a wire brush as well. So the last coil of that spring was pointing to the back. If you need that securing mount out of there, all that stuff comes out of the top of the spring. The spring assembly on the left is a spring I got out of a V70, a 99 model, and the spring on the right is the one that came out of my wagon. And as you can see, the shock to the left came out of the V70, and the shock to the right is the Nivomats. And the Nivomats is designed to support weight, where normally most of your weight is supported by the springs and they do your ride height. But when you got the Nivomats in, you have thinner springs that don't support the weight as much. You may be able to see that the springs on the left is a lot thicker than the springs on the right. The spring on the left out of that V70 will support the weight and create the ride height. If you need to, you can get the springs out of an 850 sedan. They're about an inch longer than the ones out of the V70 that I got. They're also stiffer, so they would create a higher ride height than the ones that I got out of the V70. Next, I'm going to go ahead and set this V70 spring in the spring seat and start the bolt on the lower mount, and then I'm going to raise the suspension so that that could be secure, and then I'm going to set the shock in place and start the top of the shock and then come down and put the bottom of the shock in the mount. I moved the jack to the spot right under the shock mount, and I have the spring in place and the lower mount in place on it. As you can see, the bolt sticking out and the tab. So I'm going to go ahead and put the bolt on there and tighten it down. I'm not sure what that torque value is, so I'm going to tighten it down real tight for now. And once I get that tight, I'm going to go ahead and put the shock up through the hole up there, and then put it on the stud here and go up top and start the bolt up top, and then I'm going to tighten it on the stud down here. Now my battery died, so I had to skip through a little bit at the end, but I tightened up the bolt on the bottom of the spring. I jacked the car up, I put the shock in, I tightened up the bolt on it down here for the shock. Then I came up inside. After lowering the car, I tightened it there as tight as I could, and then I let the car the whole way down. Now, to tighten this up in here, you're either going to have to use a air gun or a impact gun, or get some special tool to hold the center screw while you turn the 15mm nut, because if you just put a ratchet on there, it just spins and spins and spins and doesn't tighten up. After that, you put your panel back in and put the car back together, put your tools away. After all said and done, I'm at 25 1/4. So I'm about an inch higher than I was before I swapped them. If you got any questions, go ahead and post them. All the torque values will be in the comments below. If you feel that this information was useful, please like it and share it with your social media friends. You can subscribe to my channel so that you will get notifications of future videos that I post. You can follow me on Twitter, and if you need to contact me directly, please visit my website. And if you have any questions, leave them below, and someone or myself will reply to them. Again, thank you very much for watching.